What if a nation, by, well, any logical measure, facing just overwhelming odds, abandoned by allies, completely outgunned, what if it shouldn't really exist, but somehow it fought for and won its independence anyway? How does something like that, something seemingly impossible, actually become reality?
That's a powerful question. It really gets to the heart of what gives a people the strength to define their own path, even when everything seems stacked against them. It's, a force that goes beyond just military might or economic power.
Exactly. And today, we're doing a deep dive into exactly that kind of story. The truly remarkable history of Eritrea. It's a country whose very existence feels like a testament to an almost unbelievable level of resilience, of sheer willpower.
It really does. When you look at the scale of the challenges, the
Oh,
sheer odds, well, their victory seems almost like a historical outlier.
it does. So we'll be drawing our insights today from a historical account that chronicles Eritrea's incredibly long, very arduous journey towards becoming a state.
And it's a narrative that's less about maybe geopolitical inevitability and much more about the raw, unyielding will of a people who simply refused, point blank, to be defeated.
Right. So our mission in this deep dive is to try and understand the forces involved, both those crushing external pressures and also the profound internal strengths that shaped this entire struggle.
Hmm.
Specifically, we really want to unpack the story of how did the Eritrean people, going against all conventional logic, outnumbered, outgunned, betrayed time and again, how did they actually secure their independence? How did they take what looked like a totally hopeless cause and make it real through what the source calls this sheer force of character?
Well, and that force of character, it didn't just appear out of nowhere. The source material makes it really clear it was forged, hammered out over decades and decades of struggle,
Right from the beginning.
right from the moment foreign powers first arrived and laid claim to their land.
Okay, let's get into that then. The source tells us this intense, defining struggle really kicks off on a specific date, January 1st, 1890. That's when the Italians arrive and claim Eritrea as their colony.
Yeah, the formal beginning.
And the account makes it crystal clear. From day one, it was just brutal.
Absolutely. The historical account really emphasizes that Eritreans weren't just, subjected to foreign rule. They were immediately stripped of their most basic human rights, right from the very start of the Italian occupation.
No easing into it.
No gradual transition. It was an immediate imposition of control, a denial of dignity right off the bat.
And the reality on the ground, it was incredibly harsh. It wasn't just economic exploitation, was it? The source uses some really stark language here.
It does. It talks about practices that were akin to apartheid, even mentioning ethnic cleansing under Italian rule. It really paints a picture of severe systemic oppression.
Designed to what?
Yeah.
Just completely subjugate the population.
That seems to be the implication. The source highlights that this period wasn't just about setting up administration or economic control. It was fundamentally about racial segregation, racial control.
Like apartheid, as you said.
Exactly. Mirroring systems where Eritreans were treated as second-class citizens in their own homeland, and, in the most extreme cases, facing violence aimed at displacing them, or even eliminating certain groups.
Wow.
Yeah, the source is unambiguous. The Italian occupation was marked by a profound lack of respect for the lives and the rights of the Eritrean people.
Now, you'd think that level of sustained systemic oppression,
Yeah.
I mean, facing down apartheid-like conditions, violence, ethnic cleansing, you'd think that would just lead to submission, right? They would grind people down until resistance just felt impossible.
That would be the logical assumption.
But the source indicates that wasn't what happened in Eritrea. Not at all.
And this is what's truly fascinating and really central to this whole story of Eritrean resilience. Instead of leading to submission, this intense oppression actually acted as a catalyst. It sparked resistance. Yeah, the account notes that resistance movements started to kind of sprout up across the country, almost organically, it seems, in direct response to the harshness of Italian rule.
So not just one big rebellion, but lots of smaller ones?
Exactly. It wasn't a single pre-planned thing. It was multiple points of opposition emerging from different parts of the population. It showed a widespread refusal to just accept this fate.
Okay, so how did the Italians react to this resistance bubbling up? Did they try negotiation, administrative changes, anything like that?
No. The source describes a consistently brutal response, unyielding. The Italian administration met any resistance with extreme violence.
How extreme?
Well, they specifically targeted the leaders of these emerging movements. They executed not only the identified leaders, but often their followers too.
Whole groups.
Sometimes, yes. It was a deliberate effort to install fear, to dismantle any organized opposition before it could really gain momentum. A clear strategy of, decapitation and terror.
But, and this is like
Yep.
a really pivotal point the source makes, their efforts didn't actually work. They didn't crush the spirit. The account says these brutal tactics didn't deter the, quote, emerging brave leaders.
And this is where you start to see the very first signs of that extraordinary resilience we're talking about. Despite facing summary executions, prison, overwhelming military force from a, technologically superior power, the resistance just kept going.
Mm.
The source implies that the very harshness of the Italian response, while obviously devastating, might have inadvertently hardened the resolve of those who chose to fight back. Being the underdog wasn't just a weakness, it fostered a particular kind of strength.
So who were these early resistors? What were they actually doing beyond just, scattered acts of defiance?
The source calls them, quite compellingly, revolutionaries born out of oppression.
That's a powerful phrase.
It is. It's key. Their identity, their purpose, was forged by the very conditions they were fighting against. These weren't just rebels, they were foundational figures, and they played a crucial role, not just in, physically fighting the Italians, but in something much deeper, much more profound for the future.
Which was? Galvanizing the people. Is that it?
Precisely. The source says they galvanized the people. They started uniting disparate communities, different interests under this common cause, and maybe most importantly, for the long, long struggle ahead.
Yeah.
They created a sense of a common identity and destiny. They helped people look beyond their immediate village, their region, their specific grievance, towards a shared future, a future free from foreign control.
Why was creating that sense of common identity, of a shared destiny, so critical at this early stage,
Yeah.
especially under such extreme pressure?
Well, because it provided the essential glue, didn't it? To unite a really diverse population against a single powerful enemy. They weren't just separate groups suffering in isolation anymore.
They started seeing themselves as Eritrean.
Exactly. As one people, Eritreans. With a shared history of oppression, yes, but also a shared desired future of freedom and that collective vision. It was far more powerful than just individual anger or regional complaints.
So this desire for a life free from foreign oppression, it wasn't just about personal liberation or getting the Italians out of their specific town. It was fundamentally about building something collective, building a nation.
Yes. The source explicitly states that this shared desire and the whole process of resisting together helped build a strong Eritrean identity, as well as unite the Eritrean people with strong sense of nationalism.
Nationalism born from resistance.
Right. And it goes even further. Critically, the source calls this growing nationalism a strength that was necessary for them to prepare for the fight that was to come. This wasn't just a vague feeling, it was vital preparation, mental, spiritual preparation for the decades of intense struggle that lay ahead.
Wow. Okay. So right here, under the boot of Italian colonialism, facing down apartheid, executions, the absolute foundation is being laid. This period of being the underdog, of constantly resisting, enduring just immense suffering, it didn't just produce individuals willing to fight. It forged a collective character.
Yes.
It created that deep-seated unity, that determination that the source points to as absolutely essential for the eventual, almost unbelievable fight for independence later on. This wasn't some accidental byproduct. It was built brick by painful brick through shared suffering and this just unyielding spirit of resistance.
Exactly. The source shows us the origin point, the very beginning of that seemingly improbable strength. It was cultivated right there in the intense heat of that early oppression. It transformed hardship into a unifying force.
Okay, so fast forward. The Italian era finally ends in 1941. Mussolini's government collapses during World War II, and the source describes this moment as a huge step and sigh of relief for Eritreans.
Yeah.
After, 50 years of colonialism?
51 years, yeah. There was a real palpable sense of possibility. The account even notes that symbols of this hope were literally scattered around pamphlets promising independence found amongst the debris of the war.
Like whispers of freedom.
Exactly. There was this widespread belief that the dark chapter was finally closing, and a new era, an era of freedom, was about to begin.
So with the Italians gone, the Allied forces take control. And initially, it's the British who are put in charge of administering Eritrea. How were they received? How did Eritreans feel about the British arriving?
The account says the Eritrean people welcomed the British with open arms.
Really? After decades of foreign rule?
Yeah, but it wasn't just seeing one occupier replaced by another. The source is clear why they were welcomed so warmly. It says, with the British came the possibility of independence and increased social mobility.
Ah, okay. So the British presence was seen as maybe a temporary step towards that ultimate goal of self-rule, the goal that had been simmering under the Italians.
That was the hope. That was the perception.
And this wave of hope, this possibility of independence, I imagine it must have energized the political scene.
Oh, absolutely. The source mentions the rapid emergence and growth of several Eritrean nationalist movements during this British interim period.
Building on that identity forged earlier.
Exactly. Building on that sense of common identity from the Italian era, these groups all shared that core objective: consolidate the country as one unified entity and achieve full independence now that it finally seemed within reach.
But that hope, as we know from history, and as the source confirms, it wasn't destined to last, was it? That promise of self-determination, which seemed so close, it started to slip away.
Unfortunately, yes. Very quickly, actually. The source details a swift and, frankly, profound betrayal under the British administration. Almost immediately after establishing control, the British did something quite stunning.
What was that?
They adopted the Italian administration code.
Wait, they adopted the legal framework, the administrative rules of the Italians? The very regime Eritreans had just spent 50 years resisting and suffering under. The system with apartheid elements, discrimination.
That is precisely what the source states. You can imagine the crushing disappointment. The British chose to perpetuate, not dismantle, the instruments of colonial rule.
Unbelievable.
And it wasn't just adopting the code. They specifically left in effect the racial laws and other discriminatory practices that had defined the Italian occupation. The structure of oppression didn't vanish with the Italians. It was effectively maintained by the new administrators.
The consequences for the Eritrean population, after having such high hopes, must have been devastating.
They were dire, according to the account. The economic and social impact was immediate and severe. The source notes this continuation of discrimination, this lack of meaningful change, left many Eritreans not just unemployed, but facing extreme hardship. It mentions them being devastated by hunger and lack of medical care.
So that initial welcome, the optimism for a better future under the British, it soured very quickly.
It did, as the reality of continued marginalization set in.
And it wasn't just internal policies causing problems, was it? External forces, the bigger geopolitical picture, started actively working against Eritrean independence.
This is where the story becomes a really stark illustration of how the interests of powerful nations can just completely override the aspirations of smaller populations.
How so?
Well, the United States, as a key member of the Allies and, an emerging superpower, began supporting Ethiopia's claim to Eritrea. Emperor Haile Selassie had his own historical claims, his own strategic ambitions in the region.
And Britain. They were the administering powers supposedly preparing Eritrea for some kind of future. Did they push back?
Quite the opposite. The source states that Britain aligned itself with the U.S. position and actively pushed for Eritrea's union with Ethiopia.
So the power entrusted by the international community with Eritrea's temporary administration was actually working to undermine its independence, to facilitate its absorption by another country.
That's what the source indicates, yes, working actively against it.
And they didn't just support the idea politically, did they? The source suggests they took deliberate actions, physical actions on the ground, to weaken Eritrea.
Yes, and this is a particularly cynical detail the source highlights. In a calculated effort to, quote, persuade Eritreans that they were too weak to survive independently, basically trying to manufacture a self-fulfilling prophecy, the British engaged in systematic dismantling.
Dismantling what?
They destroyed or sold much of Eritrea's assets and infrastructure. A lot of this had been built or developed during the Italian period. They even sent valuable machinery, equipment to their other colonies in Africa and Asia.
They were literally stripping the country. Its resources, its economic base, its physical capabilities, gone.
That was the clear intention, according to the source. The British believed that dismantling Eritrea's relatively advanced infrastructure, things like port facilities, railways, factories, valuable equipment, would cripple its economy.
Making independence look impossible.
Exactly. Making integration with Ethiopia seem economically inevitable, maybe even necessary for survival. They were trying to make independence look completely unviable.
So external powers weren't just deciding Eritrea's fate in some distant conference room. They were actively sabotaging its future potential right there, on the ground, trying to manipulate both the perception and the reality of whether it could survive alone.
Precisely. It's a powerful example of how strategic interests can translate directly into deliberate actions that undermine a people's right to choose their own future. The source uses strong language here. It says Haile Selassie and the British government tirelessly pressured to destabilize Eritrea and force Ethiopia's annexation. This wasn't passive diplomacy, it was an active campaign. Pressure and sabotage.
Okay, so given all this deliberate effort to make Eritrea look weak, dependent, incapable of standing alone, how did the Eritrean people react? Did they start to lose hope? Did they buy the narrative that they could make it independently?
This is where that strength of identity, that nationalism forged under the Eritreans, proved absolutely crucial. The source is completely unequivocal on this point.
What does it say?
It says, the British efforts did not impact the will of the Eritrean people.
Really? Despite the economic sabotage, the discrimination, the pressure from global powers.
Despite all of it, the majority of the Eritrean population, across different political groups, continued to push resolutely for a fully independent state.
So their desire for self-determination wasn't fragile. It wasn't dependent on circumstances. It was incredibly resilient. It could withstand economic warfare, intense political pressure.
It demonstrated a depth of commitment that went far beyond immediate economic worries or political maneuvering. That sense of common identity, the vision of an independent Eritrea built during those difficult Italian years, it was proving to be an incredibly deep-rooted, incredibly resilient force against all this external manipulation.
And all of this pressure, this internal yearning for independence, it all led to a critical decision by the global community, by the UN in 1950.
Yes. After various commissions, proposals, debates, the United Nations stepped in and made a pivotal decision. Instead of granting independence, as the majority wished, they decided to federate Eritrea with Ethiopia.
A federation. What was the official reason? The stated justification given by the UN for this decision.
The source says it was formally presented as a gesture of appreciation for Ethiopia's support of the Allies in WWII. Ethiopia had resisted the Italian invasion, fought alongside the Allies, and Eritrea's fate was framed as, essentially, a reward for Ethiopia's contribution.
So Eritrea's future, its right to self-determination, was decided not based on the will of Eritreans themselves, but as a reward for another country's wartime role.
That's precisely how the source frames the injustice of it. And it highlights this by noting the decision was made despite Eritreans' repeated calls for independence. These calls were loud, they were clear petitions, political parties, demonstrations. Their voice was definitely heard.
But ignored.
But ultimately disregarded by the international body.
And this is the context for that really famous, incredibly revealing quote from the U.S. Secretary of State at the time, John Foster Dulles. The source includes it.
Yes, it's perhaps one of the most candid admissions of real politics, just overriding principles you'll ever find. Dulles stated, and it's worth quoting directly from the source here.
Okay.
From the point of justice, the opinion of the Eritrean people must receive consideration. Nevertheless, the strategic interests of the United States in the Red Sea basin and considerations of security and world peace make it necessary that the country, Eritrea, be linked with our ally, Ethiopia.
Wow. He just comes right out and says it. While justice demands considering the Eritrean people's opinion, U.S. strategic interests in the Red Sea completely override that. Justice takes a backseat to security concerns and alliances.
It strips away any pretense, doesn't it? Any pretense that the decision was about the well-being or the self-determination of Eritreans. It was explicitly about the strategic needs, the alliances of powerful nations in a crucial waterway.
So Eritrea's geography, which the British tried to leverage by dismantling its infrastructure,
Right.
now became the primary reason its political fate was sealed by others.
Its location became the deciding factor on the international stage.
And the source really underscores how exceptional Eritrea's fate was by comparing it to other former Italian colonies after the war.
It does. It points out that other territories previously under Italian rule, like Libya and Somalia, were granted their independence in the post-war period.
So it wasn't a blanket policy.
No. This comparison emphasizes that Eritrea's unique outcome, being forced into this federation against the clear wishes of its people, was directly attributable, as Dulles basically admitted, due to Eritrea's strategic location on the Red Sea. Their geography became a curse, leading to their political desires being sacrificed for bigger power interests.
So the UN decision, presented as this federation, was basically a forced marriage,
Hmm.
driven by external strategic calculations, completely ignoring the national identity and the will for independence that had been building for 50, 60 years.
Hmm.
This decision just set the stage for the next, even more difficult phase, didn't it?
It absolutely did. The Federation arrangement, as it was outlined in the UN resolution, supposedly granted Eritrea, quote, certain sovereignty and democratic freedoms.
Okay, what did that supposed autonomy look like? On paper, at least, according to the source.
Well, the document indicated Eritrea was meant to have its own flag, control over its domestic affairs, including its own police force and elected assembly, the right to use its own languages.
So a degree of self-rule.
It was designed as a compromise, on paper, trying to balance Ethiopian claims and those strategic interests with some level of Eritrean autonomy.
But just like the promises of independence after World War II, these promises, embedded within the Federation, they were.
Soon broken is the phrase the source uses. The reality of the Federation very quickly diverged from its theoretical basis. The source states the immediate effect was that Eritreans quickly found themselves becoming marginalized citizens in their own country under Ethiopian occupation.
So that limited sovereignty, the autonomy they were supposedly granted, it just evaporated.
Pretty much. The promised autonomy was rapidly undermined in practice.
So they went from hoping for full independence to being pushed into this federation, and then immediately finding themselves treated as second-class citizens within their own land, even under the terms of a UN-mandated structure.
That's the bleak picture the source paints. The Federation didn't evolve into any kind of true partnership or balanced autonomy. From the Eritrean perspective, it served as little more than a transitional phase towards complete control by Ethiopia. The spirit of the UN resolution was disregarded almost from the get-go by the Ethiopian government.
And after only a decade of this failing federation, the situation escalated dramatically and permanently.
It did. The source states that in 1961, so just 10 years into the federal arrangement, the Haile Selassie regime in Ethiopia took the final step. They completely disregarded the UN resolution that had created the federation in the first place.
Yeah.
Ethiopia forcefully annexed the country. The pretense of a federal arrangement was just dropped entirely. Finished.
So the federation, which was already failing to deliver its promised autonomy, was simply dissolved by force, replaced with outright unilateral annexation by Ethiopia.
Exactly. And with that annexation came the complete suppression of any remaining shred, any vestige of Eritrean autonomy or identity. The source notes that all the federal laws that were in effect in the country were banned, just like that, overnight.
So Eritrea was now treated not as a partner, not even as a federated entity, but just as a province, a fully absorbed province of Ethiopia.
That was the reality.
And the level of oppression, the control, did it increase significantly at this point?
Oh, drastically. The source describes a horrifying escalation. With direct annexation, the regime began exercising brutality the Eritrean people have never experienced before.
Worse than the Italians. Worse than the British, period.
According to the source, yes, this wasn't just administrative oppression or discrimination anymore. It was a level of violence, of cruelty that surpassed the hardships they had endured before.
What kind of specific brutality are we talking about here, based on the source's account?
The account gives some chilling examples of this intensified repression. Things like indiscriminate killing of innocent people, burning villages and property were rampant.
Indiscriminate, so not just targeting rebels, but civilians.
That's what it implies. Widespread violence against the civilian population, designed to terrorize them into submission. The source actually says the suffering inflicted reached a point that the Eritrean people found it hard to shoulder, which indicates a burden of pain, of loss that was almost unbearable.
And alongside the physical violence, was there also a systematic effort to dismantle Eritrean culture, their identity?
Yeah.
Striking at the very heart of that nationalism we talked about.
Yes, absolutely. The source details cultural suppression as a key component of the Ethiopian regime's annexation policy. Eritreans were banned from speaking their own languages in schools, in official settings.
And forced to learn Ethiopian languages instead.
Forced to learn Amharic, yeah. One of the dominant Ethiopian languages. This was a direct assault on their cultural heritage, their means of expression, a clear attempt to erase their distinct identity.
And was it just language?
No, it went further. The source states that censorship became the standard, stifling any form of independent thought or expression. Eritreans were forced to dissolve their political parties, trade unions, any other form of organized civil society that could articulate an independent Eritrean voice.
No freedom of association.
None. And the source explicitly notes press freedoms were non-existent. So any avenue for independent political activity, cultural expression, free association, systematically shut down, crushed.
Okay, so let's just recap this trajectory. Decades of brutal Italian colonialism, which paradoxically births a national identity.
Yeah.
Then period of false hope, deliberate sabotage under the British and international powers, a betrayal by the global community leading to a failed federation driven by strategic interests, and finally outright annexation, accompanied by unprecedented brutality and systematic cultural suppression.
Yeah.
You might reasonably think, okay, now the spirit of resistance, that hard-won sense of identity, that determination, surely now it would finally be broken.
That's the logical conclusion, isn't it? That any conventional assessment would draw. That sustained, overwhelming force and suffering would inevitably crush dissent, lead to resignation.
But the source tells a fundamentally different story. A story that really explains Eritrea's improbable existence.
It does.
And that story is that this suffering, this relentless pressure, it didn't break them.
The source states it absolutely unequivocally. This suffering did not break down the social fabric of Eritrea, but served to fuel their desire for independence. It didn't defeat their spirit, it intensified it. It hardened their resolve even further.
It sounds like each betrayal, each new level of oppression, rather than crushing their will, just reinforced their conviction that they had absolutely no choice but to fight for themselves.
Yes. The account highlights that powerful feeling of being betrayed once again. Betrayed by the UN's federation decision, then betrayed again by Ethiopia's annexation. This left Eritreans with the stark realization that any political path, any peaceful means, had been exhausted or ignored or just brutally suppressed.
Leaving only one option.
Leaving them, as the source says, with no option but to resist and reclaim their sense of identity through force, through armed struggle.
And this long, painful journey marked by that early resistance under the Italians, the forging of identity through hardship, the betrayals after World War II, the crushing brutality of annexation, it all led to one specific moment, marked by a single symbolic act.
That's right. The source pinpoints the exact spark.
Yeah.
The moment that ignited the full-scale, decades-long armed struggle. In 1961, out in the western lowlands, a man named Hamid Idris Awate, a veteran resistor, he fired the first gunshot.
The first shot, a direct response to the annexation, the brutality that followed, marking the beginning of what would become an incredibly long, incredibly difficult, and frankly, seemingly impossible fight.
The source states it very clearly. This single act marked the beginning of Eritrea's 30-year armed struggle for independence. 30 years. Just think about that length of time.
3 decades.
3 decades of continuous conflict against a much larger, internationally recognized state, Ethiopia, which had far greater resources, far greater manpower.
And for virtually all of those 30 years, Eritrea, the Eritrean people, they were fighting what looked like, by any conventional military or political analysis, a completely hopeless war.
Utterly hopeless on paper.
Outmanned, often drastically outgunned by an army equipped by various world powers over the decades, the Soviets, the U.S. at different times.
Right.
Repeatedly abandoned or betrayed by potential allies who always prioritized their own interests. Facing an enemy that controlled all the territory had international legitimacy. I mean, it's hard to overstate how insurmountable the odds looked.
And that's precisely where the core insight of this source material, the real focus of our deep dive, comes into sharp relief. What happened over those next 3 decades of intense, often incredibly brutal warfare?
Fighting from mountain hideouts.
Exactly. Fighting from mountain redoubts like the legendary Nakfa, enduring sieges, facing massive offensives by a vastly superior force. All of that, the source says, demonstrated to the world the strength, perseverance, and unity of the Eritrean people.
So the source is arguing this wasn't really a conventional military victory, not about better guns or genius tactics.
Not primarily, no. It argues it was driven by something much more fundamental, something internal.
So all those prior experiences, we walked through the initial Italian oppression and the resistance that birthed an identity, the dashed hopes under the British, the cynical dismantling of their infrastructure, the UN decision driven by strategic interests, the failed federation, the brutal annexation. All of that wasn't just a sequence of terrible events.
According to the source, it was the necessary forge, the crucible, the relentless fight just to preserve their identity, their culture, their very existence under the Italians, the British, the UN's decision, the Ethiopian rule. That process cultivated the precise qualities required for that seemingly impossible 30-year fight.
So the source is saying that deep-seated national character, that unbreakable unity forged in shared suffering, that sheer unwavering determination, Those were the actual forces that allowed them to endure unimaginable losses and stand against militarily superior forces for 3 decades.
That's the core argument, that the unity and determination needed to wage that seemingly unwinnable war wasn't conjured out of thin air in 1961 when Await fired that first shot.
It was built, brick by painful brick, over all those preceding decades of shared suffering, through repeated betrayals by outside powers, and through this fundamental, unyielding refusal to surrender their identity and their right to freedom.
Yes. It fulfilled the prophecy, in a way, of that nationalism, that common identity forged way back under the Italians.
So this deep dive into the source material, it shows that the improbable victory, it wasn't some miracle, it wasn't a fluke of history. It was the direct, hard-won result of a collective will that simply refused to be defeated in spirit, even when all the material odds, the political odds, looked absolutely impossible on paper.
They won because their determination, their spirit, ultimately outlasted their enemy's capacity to suppress it. It's a profound illustration of how human will, unity, and this fierce commitment to identity can become the ultimate strategic asset.
Overcoming disadvantages that, by any normal measure, should have crushed them.
Absolutely. And the source emphasizes that the very spirit that saw the Eritreans through those decades of fighting, including enduring just unimaginable conditions in places like the trenches of Nakfa, that's the same spirit they then brought to the monumental task of building a nation literally from scratch after independence was finally achieved in 1993.
So we've traced this incredible journey from the initial oppression under the Italians, where that sense of national identity was first born out of resistance against huge odds, through the post-World War II betrayals that dashed hopes under British rule and international maneuvering driven purely by strategic interest, to the brutal Ethiopian annexation that finally lit the fuse for that decades-long armed struggle in 1961. A war they fought and ultimately won against all conventional expectations for 30 long years.
And what the source material really makes clear is that Eritrea's survival, its eventual independence, it wasn't an accident. It wasn't some historical anomaly without an explanation. It was a direct result of a national character, a unity, and a determination that was forged, tempered over decades of relentless struggle against overwhelming external pressures and continuous internal repression.
That spirit needed to win that seemingly unwinnable 30-year war. It wasn't something they just discovered when the fighting started.
No.
It was built piece by painful piece, through shared suffering, through repeated international betrayals, and through this just unyielding refusal to be denied their identity, their fundamental right to freedom. It's a really powerful story about the enduring strength of human will, of unity, in the face of what the entire world basically deemed impossible.
It highlights how those deep historical roots of resistance and that shared identity can empower a people to overcome challenges that, by all conventional measures, power, resources, alliances should have been absolutely insurmountable.
So we look at this history through the lens the source provides, thinking about those repeated instances of external powers prioritizing their own strategic interests over the clear will of the Eritrean people. From the British dismantling infrastructure to the U.S. and the UN prioritizing the Ethiopian alliance over Eritrean self-determination. What does Eritrea's story tell us about the real forces that have, historically at least, shaped the map of the world?
Well, it forces you to confront whose interests really dictate those international decisions, right? Whose interests draw the borders. And it highlights the immense cost borne by populations who get caught in those larger geopolitical games, often without a voice, unless, like the Eritreans, they are willing and able to fight relentlessly to make that voice heard and impose their own reality on the world.
And when you consider that process, that long, arduous, incredibly painful process of forging a national identity, forging unity, through shared struggle against constant external pressure and brutal internal repression, how does that compare, maybe, to the formation of nations under less duress? Nations formed without that kind of intense, decades-long external interference.
That's a deep question.
What enduring lessons about resilience, about unity, about the ultimate power of collective will can we draw specifically from this historical account? From Eritrea's improbable birth, a nation that quite literally fought itself into existence against the grain of all the regional and international power dynamics. It's a story that really challenges our conventional notions of power and maybe even possibility.